Well, hello there, YouTube. It's Petey Two Finger, and I'm here. I'm about to have a yogurt, which I know there's a lot of sugar in it, but I eat yogurt for the bacteria that helps if you're having a canker sore. I've heard. I bit my. I was eating a sloppy Joe, and I bit it for the second time. I already had a infected sore in my mouth, and I bit it the second time. Man, oh man. So yeah, eating yogurt. That's your tip. This is a tip video. So if you're struggling with open sores in your mouth, canker sores, stuff like that, if you bite your tongue when you're eating, and then of course that will become like infected or whatever it is in there, disgusting, nasty, and painful. Eating yogurt is what I was told. And I suppose I should, instead of just making a video, do I look this up? Do I, yogurt canker sore? Let's do a Google search. Yogurt is a natural probiotic. Lactobacillus help fight cancer causing bacteria. Eating 1 cup of yogurt every day can transfer good bacteria to your body and help treat canker sores. Moreover, the yogurt has a cooling effect, and that's when I was last night. I had the yogurt last night, and I thought, I wonder if that's why. I had a music teacher. This was a private lessons. I was playing cornet, which is a smaller trumpet, because I was a little guy. I was not a big kid. I was a real tiny, scrawny little kid, and I wanted to play trombone because the guy came into the school and demonstrated instruments, and he did that slide, like a 2 or 3 octave dive bomb. And I heard that. He did this slide, and I lit up, and I came home, Mom, I want to play trombone. And they got me a cornet. This is the story of my life. My older brother got the guitar and the amp, which he traded and pawned. I don't know what he got for it, but the Steppy brothers, who are, they were in Dave Grohl's HBO Sonic Highways. Dave Grohl saw them when he was little. Dave Grohl came to Chicago, stayed with his cousin, who took him to the Cubby Bear for an all ages punk show. And I believe he saw Negative Element there. Now, I know that Dave Grohl reviewed Negative Element's Yes We Have No Bananas EP and did a review in his zine Dave Grohl had a zine. Anyway, the Steppy brothers were my neighbors. They were a family that had Steve, Barry, Chopper, Kyle. There was 4 boys in the Steppy brothers. They were a really outstanding family, and they became carriers of that punk rock torch. Like, my interpretation of the story was they really enjoyed reading the National Enquirer. Mrs. Steppy would occasionally buy these National Enquirer magazines if it had like an Elvis story in it, or the kids would beg her to buy these stories about Bigfoot and UFOs and Bat Boys, stuff like this. And they loved it because it's obviously, this is not true journalism. So in these tabloid newspapers, they were covering what was going on across the pond. And I remember Barry, they were hip. Like, they had Cream magazine, and Barry produced a zine. Steve was the bass player in the Chicago band Rights of the Accused, and he's on their first album. And I remember when they played in our neighborhood and the amount of cars that were there, like it was like a legitimate show, like an outdoor show. And holy cow, was there a lot of people. But they went on to make their own EP. I remember the day that their dad loaded them up in the station wagon. We're going to make a record. And it's like, it's a, like Jello Biafra talked about. Jello called them at home to tell them, keep the faith. Mrs. Steppy says, Barry, there's some guy who calls himself Jello on the phone for you. Anyway, those were my neighbors, and I believe that's where my brother's Silvertone. I know the amp was a Silvertone. I think it was a semi-hollow body guitar that he had, but he tried out to sing for them. They were looking for singers for a while till they ended up finding Sparky was their first like legitimate singer. Scott Bumer, and then and I'll tell you what they got the guy that they got. I went to school with him. He was a senior, and he wore really expensive clothes. He wore like John Lennon glasses and kind of like psychedelic. Like he really had a strong fashion sense. I forgot what that guy's name was. But they did a reunion at the Cubby Bear or where, I forget where the reunion was. They were on this show called Chicago, and that's on YouTube. Negative Element. Yes, we have no bananas. You can check all this out. It's really got a strong sense of humor. It's almost like they're mocking punk rock in it. They're taking, it's like their version of a punk album, but it's really funny. It's really funny stuff. The lyrics, the concepts that anti-religion, anti-police, anti-Reagan, anti-establishment. It's that type of stuff. Anti-Pac-Man. That's what they had a Pac-Man bass Chopper played, and just the coolest American family. And I was blessed to grow up. There was one house in between ours and the Steppies, and they moved to Peoria where they started a punk scene down there. There's a guy named Bloody Mess who came up involved with them. The first show where G.G. Allen pooped on stage was at the Peoria VFW hall. And I believe it was Bloody Mess who was in contact with him and who rented the hall and had him come down there, and he ate X-Lax on the bus the entire way from New York to Peoria. And then by the time he got there, he was unbelievably flatulent, and he stuck the microphone in the back of his pants and was walking around the VFW hall, and the farts were coming out of the PA. And then he defecated on the stage, and I guess it was ungodly, unnatural, the amount of feces and the stench. And everyone was screaming and running. They were running into other bars saying, "There's a madman." It was G.G. Allen pooping. So those were my neighbors growing up. And I had a bird's eye view to that DIY aesthetic of, make your own thing happen. Like when I went out there, they moved, and then the next year or so I went out there and visited them, and they had built a half pipe, and they were establishing a healthy punk scene in Peoria, Illinois. So today's video, I got sidetracked here in the beginning talking about the Steppy brothers, which I I know I've talked about these guys on my channel before, but I am so proud that I lived like right next to them when I grew up. You know, I see people talking about them on the internet, and I'm like, yep, they were my neighbors, the coolest family. And I'm Facebook friends with Steve, the oldest Steppy brother. I talked to them recently. I talked to Mrs. Steppy for about an hour. We caught up on neighborhood gossip, and that was probably 10 years ago now. You know, it was probably around Y2K. It's probably when I made that call. And I talked to Chopper, who was like a year younger than me, Todd Chopper Steppy. And I talked to Kyle, who was living in Portland. He was the youngest Steppy brother. And I remember he did they had a lot of little side projects and little bands that did small things. One of those was, and I don't know what it was called, but Barry dressed Kyle was really diminutive. He was young. So he was probably like 10 or 12, and Barry dressed him up like Hugh Hefner. So he had a red velvet robe and a pipe. And he had him sitting on a stool, like doing beat poetry, while Barry like vamped on chords. And they had this little act, and they performed that. They played the Mrs. Steppy was fit. Like Joe and Connie used to jog every night, and her job, she was the receptionist at the health club. There was a local, it was called the Chalet, Willow Springs Health Chalet. She was the woman that would greet you. And she also, like, they had bands, so she would book her kids in there as opening acts and stuff like that from time to time. So I know Kyle played that at least one show in this bizarre thing that Barry cooked up, where Kyle played like an elderly grump and recited this angry beat poetry on a stool with a pipe. And I think they actually played a gig with that. So there's a movie called You Weren't There, the Chicago punk scene from 1976 to 1982 or something like that. And they're in it. Chopper and Barry are in it. They interview them. They're in it a little bit. There's a little bit of footage of them in the end, but like all the other bands, they all talk about them. And the best parts of that movie are the stories these other musicians tell about the Steppy Brothers. Anytime they bring their name up, everyone in the room starts laughing. And they're kind of trying to describe something that's really hard to describe because of how unique this family was. They were really weird. They were really weird. They were really funny, and they were brilliant. You know, they were really, really a shining star in a sea of mediocrity. I remember when they talked about coming up, they said it was a lot of guys who had their hair parted in the middle, feathered back. They said that's what they were up against. Guys like this beating them up, or what, you know, chasing after them, harassing them. These guys stood their own. They weren't victims in any sense of the way, but they were unique in that they didn't really stand for drug and alcohol thing. It was about being yourself. That was their message. And I really admired them for that. So, that being said, I guess I'll finish the video off Or do I make another video? I guess I surely should make another video and put what I had intended to make. So yeah, I guess I'll call this one My Neighbors, and I'll put this up. And if you're looking for the actual video I had intended to make, because see, I got sidechained when I thought about my brother's guitar. And I can't just say he sold it to the Steppies, because it doesn't carry a weight unless you kind of know who they are. Because like you can look them up, and people know, there are people out there who know who the Steppy brothers were. There's a book about the punk scene in Peoria, and they were the guys that started it. You know, I mean, there may have been some other people there as well. I don't want to, give them all the credit, but they were. And forgive me for not knowing the name of that book, but it came out not even a year ago, and it's supposed to be a really good book. As a matter of fact, I got to get a copy of that. So, you guys take care, and hopefully I'll see you in my next video, which is about this. I'll give you that much. All right, take care. Stay cool. Hug your pets. And peace. We're supposed to do that.